Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm so glad we almost have a full room because I saw some of the queues yesterday. I appreciate it is Saturday morning, so we are competing with the weekend. So thank you, everybody, for being here. But welcome because you've come to the most interesting session, I think, of the entire panel. Thank you. I've planted some audience members here to make sure. Okay, the panel is called Exploring New News. And what is new news? It's really about how do we sort of move away from what I'm calling old news, which is traditional bad, typically negative news, which is what a lot of us trade in. And we've used the phrase decolonizing media because I think everybody's using it. It's one of those in words right now. But by that, the way we're using it today, it's about how we can rethink, how we can reframe, and we can rebuild news so that it's much more inclusive, it's much more representative, and it's much more sort of reflective of society. So we've chosen to focus this edition or this session on Africa. And it's not because Africa is the only region that's sort of affected by, negative, old, bad news. It's because I think it's one of the regions that suffers the most from negative, stereotypical, persistent, old narratives and old tropes and old frames that just don't seem to go away. So the other reason why we're focusing on Africa is because I'm Nigerian, I'm African, and I like to talk about my continent, but also I run an organization called Africa No Filter that is entirely focused on trying to change the narrative about Africa. So, how do we redefine news, and why should we? Well, first of all, I think there's two global trends that are driving us in that way. One of them was covered in a session on Thursday, news avoidance. I don't know, how many people went to that session on news avoidance? Oh, good, I'm going to pretend I gave all the, I know all the answers to it. But that session, it was with Nick Newell, I think it was, from the Reuters Institute. And they came up with 7 really practical strategies to counter news avoidance. It was something like a third of people were actually avoiding news. And at the beginning of the session, they actually asked the journalists in the room how many of them had avoided watching the news. And a lot of people in the room, journalists, put their hands up. So it is a very real thing. Some of the things that came out of that session was that stories need to be more relatable. People need to listen to your audience. You needed more diversity in the newsroom, and they wanted different formats. But the one point, and I think it was the 7th point that I particularly liked, was about solutions journalism and just creating more hope, stories that created more hope. The second trend is that there's a new breed of, air quotes, journalists who haven't been trained in the newsroom, who have got huge following on social media. They're content creators. One of them is a grantee of ours. Her name is Marie Mbulu. She puts out a platform called Habari Njeri. She has something like, I think, 700,000 followers, but she has views of her content of up to 8 million. She is a one-woman publishing media giant in Africa, and she's not a journalist. And she actually says, Habari Njeri apparently in Swahili, I think, means good news, Africa. And she said she got tired of all this barrage of negative news, so she just puts out her own positive news. I don't really want to make this about positive news because I think people start thinking it's about, cats and animals. It's about 2 things. It's about good news, positive news, better stories, we call it, but it's also about stories being told better. It's about context. It's about nuance. There's a lot more to it. So this is not a PR campaign for Africa or for any region that's been suffering. But what a lot of journalists say to me is, why should I care? It's not my job to do PR for Africa. It's not my job to write good news stories. It's my job to hold power to account and, do all these important things that journalists genuinely need to do. And it's not a case of either or. It's actually both. Because when you look at a narrative, it's stories told over time. So it's not the single story, it's the persistent stories that create narrative. And the narrative for Africa has real life consequences. It has real impact. Number one, it influences aid into Africa, influences trade and investment. It influences so much policy, but it influences, more importantly, how Africans, we as Africans, see ourselves. it's responsible for a lot of the migration out of Africa. So there are real-life consequences to the kind of stories we tell. But anyway, we're here to talk about new news and reframing Africa as part of it. So I'm going to, luckily, I don't have to answer these questions. I've got a really cool panel. So I want to introduce my panel first, and then I'm going to ask them the questions. And I do want to open it up to question times after about 40 minutes. So first of all, on my right is Tomiwa Aladekomo. And he's the CEO of Big Cabal Media. And they're the publishers of something called Sipho Media, which if you haven't seen it, you need to log on and find it. It's a youth-orientated, let me just say, fun, lifestyle, whatever. But it has huge following, and it seems to have sort of, you know, gotten the zeitgeist of Nigerian youth. Yep. So it's really popular. He's going to talk about that, the kind of news that he puts out there. On my other side is Sipho Kings, who's the co-founder and publisher of The Continent. Does anybody know The Continent? Yeah, who here? Great. It's a WhatsApp-only distribution platform. It is an incredible publication, comes out every week, and their just approach to storytelling is really unique. So I'm going to have him talk about some of the stories, some of my favorites we'll talk about. On the far side is Ebele Okobi, who's the CEO of the new Humanitarian. She used to be public policy director for the EMEA region for Meta before, so she comes with a lot of experience and baggage. And finally, somebody I'm sure that you probably, that needs no introduction because she works for a funder of media. So this is Khadija Patel, who's head of programs at the International Fund for Public Interest Media. And I'm going to start with you, Khadija. So we've talked about the fact that there's all this news fatigue. There's a lot of negativity around news. And you deal with media. You're investing in media. And you guys particularly talk about supporting public interest journalism specifically. Are there any trends and are there any moves you're seeing in newsrooms across the region to start thinking about a different type of news?
Thanks very much, Moky. So I think, first of all, I think the overarching trend that we're seeing throughout the continent, throughout the world, is shrinking newsrooms, right? And I think that that must be foregrounded, first of all. That the newsrooms are being shorn of capacity, actually, to tell the complexity of the places within which they work. So when we talk about the fact that the news is too negative, or just telling one side, a lot of it, not much, but certainly in South Africa, for example, a lot of it is being driven by the fact that newsrooms are so small right now. Mm-hmm. There are so few journalists. I sat here yesterday and I said that a survey in South Africa showed that 10 years ago there were about 5,000 journalists in active employment. A more recent survey shows that that number is more like 500. This is South Africa, the most prosperous country in Africa. So what does that mean? Sipho and I worked at the Mail and Guardian a few years ago. He'll tell you that I was the best boss ever. And one of the things that I had to challenge the newsroom to do is, we tried to do these things called good news editions, right? Sipho will tell you a lot about how much it was like drawing blood out of journalists, because you would think that, we thought we'd just be giving the newsroom a chance to just go find something fun, tell us something fun and uplifting. But it's not just so easy to just kind of like just switch gears. You're telling your, courts and legal reporter, go find, a good news report. And, when she's been covering a story about corruption of, one of the most senior judges in South Africa, and then you're telling her the next week, right? What I think instead, what we need to think about is that we are complex human beings living in complex spaces. We're not, not everything is all good and not everything is all bad. And we need news products that reflect that complexity. We need
so can I just ask you, when you asked journalists to do that, were you not getting the stories? So did you drop the section?
No. We did editions. I think we did it quarterly, Sipho. We continued to do it. We continued to do it for as long as we were there. We continued to do it. We thought that it was important to also give our readership something new to look forward to. We called it the Good News Edition. But my point is that there is, journalists are already operating at full tilt They are human beings themselves. And it is very difficult sometimes to just say, right, switch over, you know. That has to come out organically. We need journalists to have the freedom to tell the whole story.
Right.
And increasingly, there isn't the space within newsrooms. The whole reason I'm a journalist, and the whole reason I've come to funding is because I understand the problem is financial. We need more journalists. We need more space to be able to tell more stories.
Okay.
And that, for me, is the underlying problem. What goes missing in these situations is actually the complexity, right?
Okay.
We are complex beings, and that's what's missing. And so that's when we have simplistic narratives that lead to populism, that leads to really bad policy.
So let me just ask you this. So you're saying fundamentally the problem is lack of funding. So if you were to have enough funding, say, for example, I don't know, when you were at Mail and Gardener, would it have changed the journalist attitude? You as an editor at the time, you had the foresight to think we need more balanced coverage, but having more money, would that have made a lot of difference?
It would have made more difference in that I would have more journalists.
To cover more
stories.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, actually...
Can I react to something on that? So, I'm just kind of coming to the framing of this panel, which is exploring new news. There is a thing to what is the fundamental framing of a publication. And so if you're a newspaper, you're producing news on a daily basis, there's an expectation from your audience. And I mean, I think for most journalists, there's a inbred thing of if it bleeds, it leads. And so, I actually have two newsrooms. So we publish Zikoko, which is a youth publication, and Tech Cabal, which is a technology publication. And often, my tech journalists get accused of being sensationalists. They're looking for the big story. They're looking for, the smoking gun. They're looking for someone's done something bad. And it's quite interesting because I think Tech Cabal, a technology publication, is a business publication. And so there is you will break big, impactful stories. And the reporters go to work day to day with that attitude. Whereas with something like Zikoko is a youth publication. We don't call it a lifestyle publication. We say we're speaking to the things that young people are passionate about. And the framing of the entire publication, the way the reporters and the writers and the storytellers that we hire think about their work isn't necessarily, we have no breaking news mandate. We have no mandate to sort of, expose anything or anyone. We're speaking to the things that young people care about. And so we have a range of formats that allow for very different framing of the conversation. And so you don't tell the reporters to go look for positive stories because on a weekly basis, the kind of formats that we have don't lend themselves to that mission. And so I'll just speak to some of those formats we have.
But I'm going to come back to you
please,
because
go
you are
ahead.
jumping the
framing.
gun
Apologies.
a little bit.
It was just it was the thing about what the journalists think of as their role, I think, is what sort of came to,
Just by show of hands in the room, how many people are actually journalists in the room? Hopefully, everybody. Okay. And then, how many people have covered a story on Africa? And how many people who've covered a story in Africa have covered a story that is not framed around poverty, conflict, corruption, poor leadership, or disease? Yay! Yay, a few people. Okay, great. Because the reason why I'm asking that was that elective, was that a choice, or your editor told you to go and cover that story? Choice. Okay, great. Because I think one of the questions that I want to ask, and I'm going to come to Sipho in a minute, is it the editor's role to oversee the overall content? Because journalists are very focused. They want to put their story out. It's a investigative story. Who's standing back and looking at the narrative? Like, what's the overall sort of thread of all the stories you've put out across the year? Is it the editor's role? So I'm going to come to you, Sipho, as well. You're publisher, but you obviously have an influence on content. How do you look at your content? Because you are covering Africa, and you do it in such a unique way. And I'm going to tell you one of my favorite stories. They covered dictators in Africa, but from a perspective of what they wore. It was like, what do African dictators wear? I thought it was a fabulous story. But anyway, tell me about how you as a sort of editor's role, look at content.
So that particular story was Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia had just died, and he was very famous for wearing these very communist-inspired shirts with two pockets. And we were like, he was a great statesman, let's do a story about it. We did the story, but then in a newsroom, and this comes to the point of how you make decisions about stories. From the very beginning, our newsroom, we were like, it has to have as many different people as possible. Because you're reporting on a continent of 54 countries and 1.3 billion people, which is very ambitious for a very small newsroom. There's 12 of us, most of them are part-time. And by having lots of different people in the newsroom, so on that particular story, that's when we go from, here's a story about a statesman, it's an obituary. It then becomes other people in the newsroom going, but he had such good style. And like, then there'd be inappropriate conversations about how military leaders can look really sexy in their uniforms, and like it snowballed quite a bit. But because we have different kinds of people in our newsroom, we were able to end up with this particular story, which is about how people style themselves when they want to be dictators. So for us, it's
Framing.
it's framing, and it's the people who make the decisions, who you enable to make the decisions, right? And in far too many newsrooms, so overseas newsrooms will have an overseas person who comes into an African country and does the storytelling, and they have their own baggage and framing and stories. And if you have an African looking at the issue, they'll look at it with a different perspective. And to Khadija's point, the real problem there is because we have no newsrooms, like the media crisis in Africa is, I don't know if catastrophic is the right word. I mean, in 2020, there was research that said there was 1,300 newspapers covering the whole continent. And this was before COVID, right? So the solution, this is what we're trying to do, is just having more journalists doing more journalism, because then you end up with lots of different stories, right? And I asked my newsroom this exact point, like, do we do enough good news? Should we do more good news? And our editor pointed out that every week we have a budget. So we work with freelancers. Our whole network of reporters are freelancers. We have a budget of about $1,500 a week to commission freelancers. So you've got to choose, right? And you've got to put your money where stories are. And if there's a revolution happening or something bad happening in a country, it's very hard not to cover it, right? Because other people aren't.
Right.
And part of our job as the fourth estate is being responsible to society beyond our readers.
But I will add that what I think that the continent does very well, because in this, every issue comes out on a Saturday, and one of the stories in there was covering the LGBTQ law in Ghana, which was obviously it's banning homosexuality. And they did it from a perspective of an individual, so it was a human interest story, and it was called Pink Shorts. It was this one guy who was on a mission, and he was marching to, I don't know, Senate or whatever, but he was wearing pink shorts. So it's not about good news, because I really want to stress this is not about good news, because again, good news relegates us to something that's not so important. It's like, we've got really important issues to cover like Gaza and Israel. It's about how you frame even the difficult stories. So this was not a good news story, but you did it in a way that was interesting.
Yeah. And it's Khadija's point of, we need complexity in our storytelling. Like, our understanding of the world is through stories. It's what helped human beings evolve. It's what we're really good at. And it's what we do in every other sphere of life. And then we get to journalism, and we just don't tell stories well. Like, a lot of journalism is just boring, or badly written, or all the other things. And let's be honest about it. That's why we don't read a lot of it. And just by having better stories, pretending you're talking to another human being when you're writing a story, like there's a person at the end of it, helps your storytelling. And then you get all of that nuance, and you do better stories, and you do a better job of covering a continent through complexity.
And I'm going to come to Tomiwa now. And Sipho Media, like I said, I think it's a really interesting publication. I went online today, and one of the stories was, we asked ChatGPT to solve Nigeria's power crisis. I mean, that is an interesting way of saying the country has no electricity, right? Well, it could, I don't know, but it had some really interesting things. But Tomiwa, that's the point, that it's not that you're necessarily avoiding, it wasn't a sort of like news story and you had to do it. It's just an interesting take. But I want to talk to you about the composition of your newsroom, because there are young people in there. They clearly look like they're having fun. Look at it, it's like fun. They're having fun, it's entertainment, but it is relevant.
Yeah, no, I think it's been really interesting building out that newsroom. And I remember early on when we were sort of thinking about the direction we were going editorially, interviewing this reporter coming from a much harder news background, and she just could not, for the life of her, figure out how we were going to be this fun, bubbly publication and still cover meaty and important things. And she didn't join our newsroom because she just could not square that. I'm happy to say that over time she's come to understand the work. And the idea is, essentially, to the news avoidance point, the news is depressing. It's really quite depressing. And I think even in a room full of journalists, very frequently you will open your Twitter feed or X feed or whatever it is, and it's just all depressing. And so in kind of thinking about the publication, we've said, we want to create content that's relatable to young people. We do want to speak to the things that matter to them in the abstract and on a daily. So we do a lot of content that's around sort of how do young people think about money, how do young people think about relationships, careers, etc. But when there are important issues, we're also speaking to them. And there's a range of ways that we can do that, where it's like, look, there's a big story and we're doing a chat GPT. How would chat GPT solve this problem? Sometimes we're doing, here's a big story about women, and then here's 5 women talking about their experiences with the same thing. Somebody asked me, how do we keep it young and fresh and relevant to young people? And I'm like, well, by hiring young people into the newsroom, because I'm an old fogey and I'm just not as connected with what it is that sort of a younger generation finds, sort of urgent and pertinent. And so we've given the newsroom a lot of freedom to speak to the things that matter to them, to think of the formats that allow them to speak to the things that matter to them. And yeah, you want experienced editors, you want experienced newsroom leaders, but you want journalists and reporters and storytellers who are closer to the audience that you're trying to speak to.
So does that come with issues that you have a young newsroom?
We did hire somebody who spent the entire interview telling us how out of touch we were, and I told
Did you hire him or fire him?
We hired her, and I told my editor as well, whatever you get after hiring the person who told you in an interview just how out of touch you were, you deserve. And she was with us for maybe 2-3 years, and she was a handful, but she did some really, really brilliant reporting and some really brilliant storytelling. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting. I hear lots of the conversations about sort of like working with Gen Z and whatever is coming next, Alpha or whatever it is. I think it's quite challenging, but I think as with reporting, as with everything, if you treat people with respect, with an understanding that they have agency and knowledge of what it is that they work and write about, I think you have to give younger people a fair degree of mentorship and leadership, and you also have to have a culture that's clear about what it is. And so we are a super fun place to work, and everybody's like, oh, it'd be so zany and cool to work in there. And then everybody comes in and they're like, oh my God, you're gonna die because it's so much work. And it's like, yeah, even putting out the fun stuff is an incredible amount of work. But people come in and they like the mission. We say we want to change the way Africans see themselves, and then the way the world sees Africa, but first the way Africans see themselves. And that means that we decide what editorially matters. We decide what framing matters for big global stories, which big global stories we want to speak to versus which African stories we want to speak to. And very frequently we're excluding things, and we're saying, actually, you know what, you want coverage of this thing, there's plenty of it in the New York Times, there's plenty of it in, like the big Nigerian newspapers. We don't have to cover it. We will decide what it is that's important. And so the people that join us kind of come in and they're game for that mission. And as they join, they learn just how much it takes to put out good content and to do good work on those topics.
Okay. So I'm going to ask another quick audience question. So who here works in a media organization where they are older than their editor? No? Okay. Because I guess it's a way of trying to figure out whether we've got young Gen Zs in powerful positions making decisions about what gets published, what gets news. So actually nobody is older than their editor in this room. Interesting. Okay, well I'm going to come to Ebele now, because Ebele runs the New Humanitarian, which by definition of what you do, you focus on humanitarian crises. That is your day-to-day. So you're every day putting out stuff that is really quite soul-destroying because it's human suffering. So I also understand that you've been going through something in your newsroom, decolonizing your newsroom. So tell me about that. How has that affected the stories that go out, and what is it you're actually doing?
Yes. Oh my God. So I think it's important when we say decolonization, we often don't have a shared or coherent meaning of what we're saying. A lot of times when people say decolonization, they think it's DEI or they think it's diversity, and it's those things. But I think understanding decolonization as a process, as a journey of ridding ourselves of colonial structures, ridding ourselves of colonial policies, ridding ourselves of colonial ways of thinking that reflect and uphold empire. And if you think of it as a process, and also as, in some ways, a never-ending process, because the process of coloniality took quite a long time, and then realizing that you're always having to interrogate it, I think you then start to realize the grasp of it. And I think at TNH, we're still in that process of realizing exactly what that means. So if you even talk about representation, so yes, representation. We do want, and at the New Humanitarian, we spend a lot of time thinking about who tells stories. But it's not just that, it's also to the point about commissioning. Who decides the framing of stories? Who decides which stories are important? Who decides which point of view is important? At the New Humanitarian, there's also, it's not journalism for the sake of journalism, it's actually journalism because we have a mission. We want to have an impact on humanitarian crises. And so if you want to have an impact on humanitarian crises, there's also a decolonization to how you frame it. So to the point about context, you'll tell a story about Haiti differently if you are including the context of Haiti. So you can tell the story of Haiti as a disaster. It's just a nightmare. We don't know what's going on. Or you can understand the context of Haiti, which is as the first republic that fought and won freedom through violence. And because of that, it was punished by the US, by Europe. And because of that, France extracted millions of dollars from it that Haiti did not finish paying until the 2000s. And so if you're telling a story about Haiti and you're saying, oh my goodness, how can we help, without understanding the extent to which Haiti is deliberately created, then your story is different. If you're telling a story about Gaza and you're talking about it as an intractable religious conflict, the story is quite different if you see it as a specific decolonial struggle. Then the framing is different, the solutions are different. And to the point about solutions-based journalism, I think what's important in the context of humanitarian crises is that sometimes you can just present the crisis. But if you're thinking about why there's a crisis, again, like if you're thinking about Francophone countries, and well, my goodness, why is Chad poor? Why is Nigeria poor? If you're thinking about it in the context of France and the CEFA and the extent to which so much of former colonies of France, the extent to which France relies upon them for its own economics, the extent to which France is a G20 country because it relies upon its former colonies, then your story might be different. Your story even about aid is different. I was on a panel where someone said, I hate this word, decolonization. And I said, that's interesting. Is it because you like colonization? Well, tell me more. And so, and he said, well, I just think, he said it's simplistic, and he talked about aid being about developed countries or countries who have more, and that what you want to do is you want to inspire those countries who have more to give, to be generous to countries that have less. And I said, this is why decolonization is an important conversation, because why do those countries have more? So to act as if it was just an act of God or like divine favor that America is rich, or divine favor that the US is rich, or divine favor that the Netherlands is rich, when that development was created on the backs of Africa, on the backs of Asia, then you tell a different story, then your solutions are different. And then finally, even the conversation about, I think you can tell bad story after bad story after bad story. One of the things that I found really interesting and encouraging in some of the coverage on Gaza, which is not coming from mainstream media at all, it's coming from a lot of really local news, is people talking across. So you have people in Brazil, indigenous communities in Brazil, you have indigenous communities in the US talking to Gaza and talking about, we recognize this struggle, we recognize the tactics in this struggle, and sharing solutions that are about, that are across. So not come in rich country and help, but really about those of us, those communities who have lived a life under the boot, sharing solutions for decolonizing journeys.
I can't even say the word.
Can't even say the word.
But Ebele, let me just pick you up on one point, because a lot of what you talked about was adding context. to the story. And one of the things I often hear back is that we just don't have the space. We don't have the space to sort of give the history of why, I don't know, Haiti's like it is, and why Francophone countries have, suffered so much. So how do you address that?
First of all, I honestly think that that's a cop-out. I think that you will read stories and they'll go on and on and on and on for paragraphs about, how they landed in Africa and the rising sun and then the hotness and the beggars on the street. They'll give you all of that, but they won't give you a sentence to let you understand the context for why you're telling the story. I think that's nonsense. I mean, I think it's absolutely possible. I think many people don't know the context, or they think it's not important to the story. But the context is the story in most of these stories. It is the story.
Okay. So I'm going to come to questions, but I'm going to do one more quick round, and I'm going to come back to you, Khadija, because I know your fund your sort of mission is about the fact that newsrooms are shrinking and that we need more funding. But I really want to understand whether or not, if the newsrooms came back in their current format, the way we're talking about old news versus new news, do you think they will survive? Do you think there has to be a shift?
Oh, there definitely has to be a shift. I think part of the current crisis also is reforging of a new culture of journalism. I think that it would be very tragic for us to emerge from this crisis with the same traditions of journalism. This is an opportunity to forge new traditions. For me, fundamentally, what we need to think about is, when we were trained as journalists, we were trained in a particular, style of what journalism, a good journalistic text story is, which was defined by, a very American tradition several hundred years ago, right? So I think that there's an opportunity as well for us to revisit how we tell stories as well. That is basically, the problem here is how we tell stories. It's not really good news, bad. It's about how we tell stories, and this is why the continent is really interesting, right? Because as a writer, to my absolute disgust, they only publish 400-word stories, and even when I've written for them, they've edited me very brutally. Never forgive them for that. But they are experimenting as well with the idea that attention spans are short and no one is reading 2,000. They do sometimes publish much longer stories, when there is merit for that. But they're experimenting with shorter texts, like more, in using a very visual style of journalism that is mobile friendly. In that same way, I think that, there needs to be more room for experimentation around forms of journalism. And I think that the real problem we have also is what we've awarded credit for good journalism, right? So good journalism in Africa particularly, like that award was always for that which mimicked Western paradigms of journalism best, right? And I'm complicit. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm complicit in it as well. I'm not saying that all Western paradigms of journalism are bad. Don't get me wrong. There is a complexity of me saying that we need to make room as well for African modes of journalism, right? And think of that as being as good, right?
I'm curious about what you mean by African modes of journalism.
So that's the thing. There is no single African mode of journalism, right?
Okay.
I think
you use the phrase. That's why I'm asking you to clarify.
But what I'm saying is that we need to make room for
other types of journalism.
Yes, for other types of journalism that come from Africa, and be able to award that the same merit.
Absolutely. Well, I'll just say with your work, because you brought up the continent. The continent is doing really well. Do you want to talk about your success in this 300-word limit that you have, and why it's why is it working? Because it is working.
So just very quickly, just one last thing on also what we think of success. I think that it would, for example, somebody who won the Pulitzer Prize last year, Mona Shalabi. Yesterday, she put on an Instagram post saying that she's out of work, right? And that's because she's been outspoken on Gaza, right? There's somebody who won the Pulitzer Prize, which is, the Oscar for journalism. So, I think there's a fundamental shift on how and who and when we can award merit to journalism, which I think is really important for us to discuss as well. And these are some of, the traps that we fall into as African journalists as well.
Right. Sipho.
So my background is in long-form climate change reporting, and I used to love doing a 1,200-word story, and like you'd have pictures on a page in a newspaper, and you could do many beautiful things. But people don't read that, right? And I think we have to be very honest with ourselves about, like, I don't read most journalism. I try, I read the headline, but then it gets boring, and the writer's trying too hard, or the editor hasn't edited properly. So one of the things we did when we started The Continent 4 years and 2 days ago is boil stories down to just, let's focus on really good editing. And in 300 words, and we talk about adding context about racism and colonialism, we have briefs which are 50, 60 words. And you can cover so much in 60 words, you really can. And you can have a sentence which says, Haiti has got problems because France has stripped it, right, out of revenge. And that's the sentence, and it's done, right? I mean, you can then have much longer pieces which you can go to for context. And that's been something we've just focused on, is edit down to the actual story and the way that people will talk to each other. I mean, when you chat to a friend, you don't go on, I mean, some people do, but you don't go on for half an hour about something. You just tell them what happened. You had like a cool conversation, you learned something interesting, this is what it was. And then there's a back and forth. And that's what we try and do. And it's incredibly hard.
How successful are you at it in terms of your circulation? Like, what is your circulation? And are you, as a business model, are you viable? Oh.
Yes. I mean, I'm here. We're here. We exist. So we have 20,000 subscribers. All of that growth has been organic. So I know there was platforms or conversations earlier this week about algorithms and the end of social. So the entire growth has been word of mouth. We don't have adverts. We don't post stories on Facebook or anything else. We have readers in 137 different countries, 48 African countries. And this is just, people want journalism, right? And they want interesting journalism. And you just do it and give it to them. At the moment, it's all philanthropic funding, which has gotten us to here. We are alive. I mean, you can always have more money, especially in the African context, because there's almost no money. Like I was saying before, our weekly freelance budget is about $1,500, which is a lot, but also not a lot. But to the point of just have fun and experiment and try new things. And to Khadija's point, African solutions to African problems is, you know.
Okay. So I want to just talk quickly again about business models, because Zikoko is viable as a business. Why?
So we are a for-profit business, relentlessly commercial. We make it's, at the beginning of the year, we set our priorities for the year, and relentlessly commercial is always in there. Revenue models, advertising is the base. Events are a big part of our revenue model. We have a tech publication, so we've built adjacent to that a data research and consulting arm that essentially does work for big tech companies or foundations looking to understand the digital economy in Africa. And I think from a business model perspective, we've always thought that the news would require resilience in its income sources. I don't know if that's the exact word. And so we're always looking, and we used to have the content studio, at the time when every big publication had a content studio. We had one, and it worked until it didn't work, and then we deprioritized it as a revenue source. But in terms of things that work until they don't work, we are always experimenting with revenue sources, because we recognize that the consulting arm might be working right now, and in 2 years it might be passé for whatever reason. If you're studying sort of the biggest media platforms globally, the New York Times is a cooking and games app that happens to do a little news on the side. And so there definitely is a shift in what it is that drives the economics of media businesses. We're aware of that. And we try to pay attention to that. I will say that some of the things that we do, for instance, our events business, are a fundamental part of our journalism. And so, for instance, Zikoko has a huge women's community. And a couple years ago, we decided we were going to do a little event to sort of like meet some of the women in our audience. And we planned for a 150-person thing. The day we started selling tickets, we kind of didn't cap the tickets, and so we sold 400 tickets the first day for the 150-person event, and it was a Friday, so I said on Monday we'll call an emergency meeting and we'll figure out what this means, and then there were 700 tickets sold by the time we had the emergency meeting on Monday. And so we're now in year 3 of an all-women's festival. It's actually happening today in Lagos. It's called Hertitude. Year 3 of an all-women's festival. That's a big part of how we reach and engage with our audience.
Right.
And so it's part of our journalism as well.
Thank you. I really want to ask, I want people to ask questions. I want to leave enough time for that. So I want to hand over to the audience. Does anybody have questions for this panel? Does anybody have any comments about how we can reinvent news, and do we need to? There. Have we got a mic? And I'd like to take 1 or 2 questions instead of individuals so we can give the panel. So there must be more questions. Oh, yeah. Abbas over here. Okay.
Hi. Sorry, there's not a comment about reinventing news, but a question for Ebele. You worked for Facebook for a long time, at a time when it has been accused of kind of, empowering old colonial power dynamics in Africa specifically. I'm interested to hear more about how, you advocated inside the company, if you did, for the decolonizing principles that you've articulated really well, and how that came about and maybe why you left.
Yeah, I'm going to take another question just to give her time to think about that. Left here,
Abbas
and then
right here.
Abbas here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have a comment. My name is Abbas. I'm from Uganda. I think I've spent the last 10 years building the next generation of journalists and training them to use solutions journalism to change narratives. And I've been asked a lot of times, why don't you cover dictators and all the bad things going on in your country? And I said, it's not really my calling, right? And I'm very unapologetic about that. And the reason is, for me, there's been lots of historical narratives about the continent and about my country in particular, and there's really an opportunity for me to use young journalists to change that. So what I say we demand, we're not even advocating for one-sided narratives of positivity. We are interested in a whole story of what's great, what's working, but also there's very many people who are covering the bad stories. So I just wanted to make sure that the demand for what at least is really important is the whole story of the continent through what's working, but also equally, if you have an opportunity, what's not working. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Abbas. So I'm going to... Yeah, I'm going to give Ebele time to, a few seconds to just represent your old organization.
Yeah, I mean, it's off topic, but anyone who knows me and anyone who knew my team at Facebook would know that we stood for nothing but decolonization. So it started by, we had an all-Black, all-African, all-Arab team, and that for many, I mean, I don't think most people here, except for, sure, don't do that. And I was very intentional about saying that if we were representing the region, it had to be only people from the region, and we also had humility. I don't think that it's any company's right to go into any country and say, this is the political environment that serves this company. So what we did is we said, no one has elected us, so we're gonna sit down and we're gonna give you the information you need. And we also saw ourselves as ambassadors for the continent, because I also covered the Middle East and Turkey. We saw ourselves as ambassadors for the continent to the company. And anyone who knows me and how I worked at Facebook will know that I was one of the loudest, most inconvenient people at Facebook because of the way that we addressed it. So.
And I just want to add something. Africa No Filter was funded by Facebook at the time, quite early on. We're 3.5 years old, and Facebook came and gave us money to change the narrative about Africa. So she actually put money where her mouth is. Okay, we're going to move on from those days now. And I know you wanted to address something that
There's something
Abbas
Abbas said that really kind of struck a nerve for me, which is being very, very strong about what it is that you will cover and what you will not cover, and where you decide what your editorial priority is. And I think, Moky, you asked a question about sort of, do the editors decide what it is that they cover? And I think that on a global basis, and I will say this is an indictment of the entire sort of like news on a global basis, and I would say the New York Times, or whatever organizations it is, I don't think editors make a strong enough stance on, we will not cover this because we don't want to cover this. We will not cover this because we don't think that it serves our audience to cover this. It's like the rise of Donald Trump or the rise of, you give him this much airtime, you give him this much space, you create him. And I think that it's actually quite cowardly that organizations don't decide, we do not want to cover X. We don't think it serves our audience, and so we won't do it. And I don't think that any organization needs to feel compelled to cover every topic in the world. Plenty of other people will cover it if you don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Okay, one more question, and then we're going to show a little video, and then you can all have your weekend back. You're welcome. Okay, there's a lady over here.
Hi. First of all, amazing panel. Super interesting. I'm Charlie. I'm from Bellingcat. I'm actually quite a young editor. And I just wanted to ask, because in the festival we've been talking a lot about collaborations helping for resources to cover conflict and to cover traditional bad stories. Can you talk about how collaborations might be powerful, for example, in resource-wise for good stories? And if you have any examples of working collaborative ways to help cover good stories? Thanks.
Does anybody want to take that?
So last week, the front page of the Continent, because we're a newspaper, we have front pages, which is really cool. Long live old school. So last week, our front page was about a neighborhood in Cairo, which has got a highway being built through it. And it's a very old neighborhood with lots of history. And that was done in collaboration with a newspaper based in the Middle East and based in Egypt specifically, called EGAB. And because we're mostly a sub-Saharan African team, that's what we know. We have very little, it's very hard accessing Arabic countries. And we have a partnership. So we worked with them and got that story. And I think that's a very good way to do it, because people on the ground know more than you do. And your newsroom, as diverse as it can be, will have many, many blind spots. And journalism is only better when we work together, because so few of us are competing, because there is almost no journalism, right? It feels like very few downsides to working together.
Okay, cool. So can we, thank you, Sipho. Can we just quickly show the video, and then we'll end it? Is the video ready? It is. You have the volume. Okay. That was an advocacy video, sorry, just had to show it, but it explains the context for this session. But before I end, I want to first of all thank my panel, but I just want to have you walk away. If you walk away with one or two thoughts, it's that there is a need to just reframe the stories. It's not about good news and cat stories, it's about how do you tell the stories in a way that doesn't have the negative impact we are seeing. So it's about better framing. It's about complexity of the story. It's about diversity in your newsroom. It's like about having young people in your newsroom. It's about having hope in your stories, solutions-based journalism. It's about longer stories, shorter stories, different formats. But it's about the will to change. I think fundamentally, we all as journalists, everybody representing the media, have to decide collectively if we want to reinvent news. I hope we will. Thank you. Bang on time.